We're in Esther chapter 1. We're down to verse 13. Remember, the king had demanded that Vashti come before him in this feast that he was holding, this drunken feast. It was more about drinking than anything else, according to what I can learn of the original language here. But she refused, and we go back and read verse 12 and notice the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. And that's where we left off last week. Now this week, we start at verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew the law and judgment. And the next unto him was Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. What shall we do unto the Queen Vashti according to law? Because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. So what we're seeing is Xerxes, and remember that's the name we know him most frequently by in history. Xerxes has done a very rash thing. And there is no doubt in my mind that part of that was due to the fact that he was well on his way to being drunk out of his mind, so to speak. And here, even though intoxication is playing a part, he did do one wise thing. He consulted with his advisors. Now, he's done in the past a lot of really weird things. But disobeying a king in that time was a very serious matter, because kings in that time held absolute authority. They could have anybody in their kingdom killed at any time that they wanted to. Daniel talks about that in chapter 4 or 5, I believe it is, that the king had that power. He could promote anyone he wanted to. He could depromote anyone he wanted to. He could basically do whatever he wanted to. And this king, Xerxes, was known for doing some very cruel punishments and putting those on people. Now we look at these 7 men, and I defy you to say those 10 times real fast. But we look at these 7 men, and we want to ask the question, well, who were they? Because they seem to have some very preeminent ability. They're men who were, notice, skilled in law and also punishments. Butler stated that there were 7 families of the first rank in Ezra 7, verse 14 in Persia, and from which he says the king was supposed to take his wives. The chiefs of each of these 7 families had access to the king at all times, except when he was in the company of one of his wives. And so these 7 men, from what we can gather from history, there seemed to be this hierarchy that filtered on down, and these 7 men were so prominent and their families were so prominent that the king was only supposed to take a wife from these 7 princes. So to speak. We'll call them princes. Now, that's going to be interesting, because we're going to notice Vashti disobeying the king, and some years later, he's going to be seeking another king. Now, when we read our context, we would think, we'd be led to believe that more than likely he chose a queen real soon after this time. But that's not the case, and we'll see it in a little bit. So Xerxes asked these 7 men, what are we going to do to Vashti? She disobeyed my order. What shall we do? But notice he said, according to the law. So again, he does another interesting thing. He's going to listen to what the law says. What do we do? And look at the situation as it develops for us. Obedience to the law was a very important principle among the Persians. Remember, in the fullness of time, Jesus was to come. Now, that's Galatians. And we notice in Galatians that fullness of time. And we've noticed in the past that the Babylonian kingdom, what did we get from that made it the fullness of times? It was the institution of the synagogues. Because the Jews couldn't go back to Jerusalem during that time. They had to worship in Babylon. They had to be able to study and to keep their history, their historical religion in perspective, and to be able to teach it to the young. And so what did the Persians bring? Well, they gave us law. Not just law. Babylonians had a law. In the Neo-Babylonian period, they followed law. The original Babylonian period, Hammurabi, or not Hammurabi, can't remember his name, but he had this code and made a stele that had it written on it. And that was found, by the way, broken up by people thinking they could get more money out of it if they sold it on the black market by breaking it up. But it was all put back together. And this king recognized law, but the Persians recognized an absolute law. In other words, if they made a law, that you couldn't make another law later that got rid of the first law. You might be able to make a law, and we'll see that in Esther, where they could circumvent it by making another law, but they could not take away the law that was made. Well, what is Christianity? It's an absolute law from an absolute monarch, our Father in heaven. And he expects it to be obeyed just as the Persians expected their laws to be obeyed. And if you didn't, there were consequences that had to be paid. And if a Christian or members of our society who are not Christian, if they disobey God's law and refuse to repent, there's going to be a day of reckoning. So the Bible throughout teaches the importance of obeying God's laws. Well, what about the laws of man? That is, governments. What did Nebuchadnezzar have to learn? What did he had to learn, according to chapter 4, that the heavens do rule. Now, that's not talking about the stars like Nebuchadnezzar thought about it. The Babylonians especially, and the Persians were as well, people who worshiped the stars. They thought that your life could be determined. If you could read the stars accurately, it would determine what your life's going to be like, what's going to happen to you. But of course, we know that's not true. And that's not what the text is talking about when they say that Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel had to learn that the heavens do rule. Look at Daniel 4 and verse 17. It said, "This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know." Watch what the living had to learn. "That the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." Now, when we look at that text, we see that it's talking about God. God sets up kingdoms. He causes them to come into existence. And not only that, but God puts over those kingdoms whoever He chooses, not who we choose. Our president serves at the pleasure of God. And we need to understand that in our time in which we live. He serves because God appointed him to be president. You say, well, wait a minute. What if the president that we have is a bad president and he leads us into all kinds of troubles? What if he causes the nation to fall? What if he causes it to become corrupt? God appointed him too. Notice the last part of Daniel 4:17. And setteth over it the basest of men, unscrupulous men, tyrants, whatever you may name. If God sets over us a ruler who leads us into destruction, it will be because God is punishing us just as he did Israel. Nebuchadnezzar was raised up by God to punish Israel, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. That empire was brought back into existence because his people needed to be punished for their idolatry. Look at Romans 13, 1 through 7. It will emphasize the same point. Let every soul be subject unto the higher. The word higher comes from the Greek word hupereko, to superior in rank authority. Let every soul be subject to the superior one in rank, in authority, in power. The word powers here is translated, or comes from the exousia, the power of the rule or government. So when it talks about the one who's superior in rank, under the word higher, under the word powers, it's signifying a government power, one who is higher in government power. And then look at what he says. For there is no power. What was that word? How is that word translated? Ruler or government, but of God. It comes from God. All governments, whether they're evil or whether they're good, whether they rule well or rule corruptly, the powers that be are ordained of God. Notice that? Tasso, to put in order, to station. God put them there. Look at verse 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth, again the Greek word antitasamahi, to range in battle against. Whosoever therefore resisteth. Whosoever therefore resisteth. Resisteth who? The power. We've already seen that defined. Resisteth. Now there's another word. It's a different word than the word resist that we saw earlier. Anesteme, to set oneself against. You want to resist the power. You want to range yourself in battle against the one who has set these powers in place. The ordinance, de at aga, the arrangement, the institution of God. And they that resist, anthis, stand against, oppose, shall receive to themselves damnation. Krima, judgment. If we've set ourselves against that power, that authority of government that God has put into effect, who God has chosen, if we array ourselves in battle against what God says, we're going to reap judgment from God. Why? Why will God cause us to reap a judgment for opposing arraying ourselves in battle against those that He's appointed. For He who we've been talking about, the one God has appointed into that office, the government that He's appointed, diakonos, one who executes the commands of another. Who does this power answer to? The God of heaven. And God puts them there for our good. Now, we look at that and we say, well, wait a minute. How can it be good if we have a ruler who abuses us, who treats us in a horrible way, may bring persecution to us as God's people? How can that be for good? Well, let's go back to Daniel and think about it. Why did God appoint Babylon? Why did God specifically appoint Nebuchadnezzar to destroy his people's cities, to take them into captivity? Was it not for good? Because that captivity was supposed to cause them to stop and think about what they had done in following the idolatrous laws of the people around them. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he, look at this, is the minister of God, says it again, a revenger, ekdekos, the one who carries out justice, the one who is the punisher, to execute wrath upon him who does evil. Wherefore, ye must needs be subject, hupat also, to subordinate. I have to subordinate myself, not only for wrath, not because I'm afraid of being punished, but also for conscience sake. Now, you and I know the Bible teaches very clearly that if we violate our conscience, even if something we believe is wrong actually is right, we stand condemned by God. We're not allowed to violate our conscience. That means that, something that may be absolutely all right for me to do, but if for some reason I think that it's not right for me to do, and I do it anyway, I have violated my conscience. Now watch what it says now in verse 6 about this government. For this cause pay ye tribute, for us, taxes. Also, for they are God's ministers, here he says it again, torgos, a public servant, attending continually upon this very thing. Look at verse 16 through 18. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes. Notice something, he didn't say that she sinned, he said she'd done wrong to the king, but also to all the princes and all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall be despised, their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. Memucan seems to be the leader of these 7 men, and he answers for the 7. And he gave 2 basic ideas behind what he's saying, but they blend into one overall idea. First, her influence. If you let this stand, Ahasuerus, her influence in refusing to obey your command is going to have an influence upon the other ladies in the kingdom. Oh, it'll spread throughout all the kingdom. Everybody will know about it. And the women will start rebelling against their husbands. Today, a lot of people tell us, what people do doesn't influence others. We know by looking, if you watch the news even just a little bit, like I do, I don't watch it very much. It's too disturbing. The news today will make you or deflate you. It will cause you to be constantly worried and worry about things. So too much of it, that's what it'll do to you. Now, I'm not saying don't watch the news. Don't get me wrong. If you want to know what's going on, I look at the headlines on my tablet, and that's it. I let it go. But today, many state influence doesn't cause you to do anything. It's not going to have an effect on others. It won't cause them to do bad things. Let's look at that from what's happened in recent days. Last Wednesday, a man named Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Why was he assassinated? Well, there are several reasons. Partly because he was a Christian, or claimed to be a Christian, I should say. He wasn't an actual Christian. He was a member of a community church. But it's also because people didn't like what the stands he was taking, biblical stands. And there was another reason that's been brought out. That is that he was a strong supporter of President Trump. Do we see a connection there? 2 assassination attempts were made on him. Oh, and also remember that fellow in New York that was the head of a company, and they assassinated him because of finances? We look at everything around us, and we have to know. We have to look at things that we see and know that the influence grows because of one person. One idea put out and kept being continually talked about, and this, and we've learned that hate speech accomplishes a task or goal. And we're seeing more and more of this kind of thing going on. We look at the riots in the streets and we say, well, how can this be? This is America. How can this be? But look at the young people who are watching all of these violent video games and participating in, and get all worked up and even pretend that they're actually the person in the game doing all of this damage. Do we wonder? God said that He would give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam. One man, one leader, one king who did sin, and watch what he said, who made Israel to sin. Now, did Jeroboam force the people to worship the golden idols that he set up in the north and south of Israel? No, he didn't force them. But he set those idols up hoping that he was giving the people an alternative, and so they wouldn't go back to Jerusalem and worship there and be influenced to turn against him and go back to David and his sons as kings. How did Jeroboam make Israel to sin? He didn't force it. The Bible also says that Baasha, Jehu, Zimri, Omri, and Ahab caused Israel to sin. And the context of those passages that talk about this show that they were involved in the same sin that Jeroboam was involved in. Did you notice something about all of those men? They were all kings of northern Israel. They caused Israel to become so involved in the sin of idolatry that God caused Assyria to conquer them, take them captive. Common thread, leaders, all men of leadership, positions of authority. The Bible tells us, be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners. Notice that in the American Standard Version. It's rendered a little easier to understand. Be not deceived. Evil companionships corrupt good morals. That is, the influence of these companions. The New King James says, be not led astray. Evil communications corrupt good manners. Influence. The second problem that Memucan talked about was the headship of the home. Oh, they're going to accuse these men of being male chauvinist, we'd say today. Don't we hear that terminology used a lot in our time? To signify anybody who thinks that a man ought to be the head of the house as God directed. Now that doesn't mean that we men have the right to just lord it over our wives. It doesn't mean that we have the right to treat them like a slave. Go in there and get me some food to eat. If I was a woman, considering God's laws, and my husband did that, oh, he'd get food all right. Probably be right over the top of his head. American society has become so anti-male that they judge these counselors and what they said by their standards, by today's so-called standards, instead of by the standards of its time, instead of by the standards that God has set. But the principle that he was concerned about is a biblical principle, a command of God. From the beginning, Adam and Eve, God determined the headship of the home. In fact, the book of Timothy tells us that a woman was to keep silence in the church. Why? Because Adam, one of the reasons was because Adam was created before Eve. But again, that doesn't mean that we men have the right to abuse our wives because God made us the head. Oh no. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to our wives' advice. We better, because sometimes their advice is better than our thinking. And we can learn from our wives. Hopefully, when they're right, we do. But in the end, any decision that's made has to be made by we males. And God holds us accountable for that. If we don't follow our wife's good advice, we're going to pay a price. Man does not have a right to establish his own standards. The headship of the husband does not mean that he can be cruel and mean and heartless. Ephesians 5:22-29. Notice what the Bible tells us. Wives, submit yourselves to who? Unto your own husband. My wife, Jenny, doesn't have to listen to what Ron says. If he tells her to do something, she needs to find out whether or not it's something that's right or wrong. But she doesn't have to obey what he says. But she has to submit herself to me. And if I make the wrong decision, she's going to have to live with the consequences, and so will I. Submit yourselves unto your own husbands. How? As unto the Lord. As you submit yourself to the Lord. How do you look at the Lord? How do you look at Jesus in your life? How do you look at the Father in your life? The Spirit? Is what they say law? For the husband is the head of the wife. Watch him how he parallels this. Even as Christ is the head of the church. And notice something else here. And he's the Savior of the body. What we men need to be aware of is that we're responsible for trying to protect our wives, to be their Savior, to help them get to heaven. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, putting ourselves in submission to Him, so let the wives be to their own husbands in only those things they really like? Only those things they agree with? No. In everything. Now, I would suggest there is a caveat to that. If I tell my wife to do something that's immoral, she better disobey me. That's not the everything that he's talking about. He's talking about everything that is right. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. And what did he do because he loved the church? What will we husbands do if we love our wives? We will give ourselves for them. If it means I have to die to save her, that's what I'll do. I'll do anything to save her. Isn't that what Jesus did? That He might sanctify. He gave Himself for the church. That He could sanctify them. That He could cleanse it with a washing of water by the Word. Why? Because He wanted to present it to Himself. He wanted to present the church to Himself as a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, like a bride that's coming to her husband down that aisle. Glorious, without spot, without wrinkle, but holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. What man doesn't love his own body? Well, it's a crazy man. It's a crazy man that will slice his arm up for no reason at all. Just, take a knife and just slice it wide open. Ain't that nice? It's a crazy man. We have to love our wives the same way we love ourselves. And folks, if we don't love ourselves, we got a problem. Now, you can go too far with that. But if we don't love ourselves enough to seek the salvation that God offers to us, to seek to be His loyal servant, we're in bad shape. Because he that loveth himself, did you notice that? He that loveth his wife loveth himself. I can't hate myself and love my wife. For no man yet hated his own flesh, but he nourishes it. I put the food into my body to keep living. I try to take care of my body by taking the medicine the doctors tell me to take, even though it's a big handful. Why? Because I cherish life. I cherish what God has given me. even as the Lord the church. He cherisheth the church. He nourishes us. Look at verse 19 and 20 of our text. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. If it please the king, it's a subtle way to gain the king's favor. That's what they're doing. They're in a sense giving him an honor and showing him a respect so that he will do what they think he ought to do. You're going to notice later on in the book of Esther that King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, seems to possibly regret getting rid of Vashti. But we'll see that later. Oh, king, make a law. If it pleases you, go ahead and make this law. Do we have a right to make laws? Yeah. Do countries have a right to make laws? Yeah. But those laws should follow God's design. I hope that every one of you, as I try to do, I try to remember every day to pray for every member of our Congress, every member of our Senate, our governors, our legislators, no matter where they are, and our president, that they make laws that are according to God's law. I pray that they'll be defeated when they try to make a law that is contrary to God's laws. But remember, the Persians, when they made a law, it was unalterable. They wanted a law made that Vashti could never come before the king again. That is, she could never come into his presence, therefore she could not be his wife. All of her power. And she did have power under the Persian rule. Wasn't like her husband, the king, but there was a certain amount of power that she had. And there was a certain amount of authority that she had. Let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. Look how they were viewing her. Oh, she's a rotten woman. She disobeyed you, king, and it's going to cause consequences on us men of the kingdom. Pick another queen to take her place. Get somebody else. Somebody that will listen to you and obey you no matter what you tell her. The pecking order was the queen and then the king's concubines. I might ask the question, I wonder why he didn't choose a new queen from among his concubines. When the king's decree is published, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both great and small. It didn't matter if you were a leader in the kingdom. Didn't matter if you were a very important man in the kingdom or whether you were a ditch digger. Their wives are going to pay attention to them. They're going to listen to them. They're going to give them honor. Zojates tells us that the word husband here is defined as owner. Oh boy. In our day and time, I want you to think about something. Isn't that what the Bible teaches? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 4, the wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. Now, I know in context, That's talking about the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. But look at the principle that's laid down there. Can respect be legislated? Oh, you can tell somebody all you want to that they have to respect the President of the United States. But if they choose, they don't have to respect him. You can legislate a law just like they tried here. You've got to show respect. But if a person doesn't want to respect someone, they're not going to do it. But under God's law, doesn't He tell us to respect other people? Doesn't He tell us to show respect to each other as Christians and to those around us in our world? Yeah. Lawmakers? Yeah. God can legislate, but man, if it's just a law of man, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Look at Romans 6:16. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants, the word servants there is doulos, slave, to obey. His servants, His slaves ye are, to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. Respect. God expects it. He expects us to humble ourselves before others, to make ourselves servants in order to honor God. We're to be God's slaves. I'm proud to be a slave of God, aren't you? Aren't you proud to be a slave? We should be. I belong to God. Well, our time's up. Unfortunately, that clock just flies. I hope that we've given us some things to think about this evening so that we can be better servants of God. We'll come back to verse 21 next week.